Guitar Wallet. How you guys doing? Good morning. Well, my name is Corey, and I'm from Liberty. I'm really excited to be here. I'm actually from Kentucky, Lexington, Kentucky. That's where I grew up, so go Wildcats. And I actually live in Columbia, South Carolina now, so I've been all around the map. If I go to Liberty, my beautiful fiance is here. Ashley, give him a wave. Yeah, that's my fiance. And honestly, just so you know my values, just so you know my values, I love Jesus. Hey. Better? Hey. Better this way. Here we go. Better? Better? Hey. Okay. So I love Jesus. It's off. There we go. Now we're good. Okay, so I love Jesus. I love his gospel, and I love his church. And I honestly can't believe that God has called me to preach it, to be a part of his mission to the world. And honestly, just so you guys know, this sermon, I genuinely believe, has the ability to impact each and every one of our lives in multiple areas. Okay, this is something that we can all take, and we can apply tomorrow, we can apply tonight, so that can change our lives. So on top of Jesus, I love my family, I love my fiance, I love the Dallas Cowboys, if anybody else does, that's my team, I love them. I also love football, I love basketball, and also, I really love seafood, okay? Like, seafood is like anytime I get a chance, I love it, especially crab and clam chowder. I don't know if anybody else is a seafood lover in the house, but that's my thing, I love it. Anywhere. I spend so much money for no reason getting seafood. But, speaking of clam chowder, there was a time, a couple months ago, I was with my fiance, then my girlfriend, and we were at a place, I won't name the name, maybe Outback Steakhouse, I don't know. And we were at Outback Steakhouse, and for some reason somebody had told me that they had clam chowder that was really good there, and I'd had it before and I liked it. I remember I was really, really excited to try some clam chowder. So, I'm getting all excited. On the way there, I'm getting all hungry. She's asking, when we sit down, she's like, what drinks do you want? And I'm like, yeah, skip the bread. Just go ahead. I want clam chowder. Bring it. I remember I'm so excited. My mouth's watering. And I remember she comes up. I'm getting all excited. I asked for 20 different crackers because I love putting a ton of crackers in there. I love clam chowder. And I remember she comes and I'm all excited. And I remember she puts it in front of me. I put the crackers in. And I get my spoon out and I take a bite. And my first thought was oh, okay, that's different. I remember I took a couple more bites, and I was like, this has got to be the worst clam chowder I ever had. It was sour, it was really clumpy, it was not soup really, it was really, really bad, okay? And I looked at Ashley and I was like, okay, this is terrible. This is some really bad clam chowder. And something else you might want to know about me. I'm not afraid to say what I think usually. I'm not afraid to speak my mind. But for some reason, when I'm at, it's really embarrassing, but when I'm at restaurants, I'm really embarrassed to tell the waiter or waitress if they do something bad, because I feel like it's mean almost. If the food's not good, I feel like I'm being mean to them, which is not the case. But I was very, very nervous. And so Ashley looked at me and she's like, okay, yeah, just tell them they'll bring you more. And I was like, okay, I got it. And she came over, she's like, how's the food? And I looked at her and I was like, it's great. And I turned back and I was like, God, that was terrible. And then she looked at me and she's like, don't you want some new clam chowder? That's one of your favorite foods and it's not good. And she got me all prepared again. The waitress came over, we're ordering food. She's like, how do you like the clam chowder? I was like, it's amazing, thank you. And I look back and I'm like, man, I gotta do it. And so I kindly built up on the confidence and she looks at me and she goes, look, Ashley does, she goes, the worst thing that can happen is she says no. Well, what's going to happen is either she's going to get you new clam chowder, she's going to take it off the bill, or she's going to do both. Or at least give you a discount. And I was like, okay, fine. So the lady comes over, I'm all worried, but finally I look at her and I'm like, well, more like we. It wasn't really just me, but more like we were like, I don't really love the clam chowder. It doesn't taste great. Is there any chance you could get it? And how a waitress was a good way. She was like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Of course. She went and got it immediately. And she brought me new clam chowder, and I'm a little nervous, and it was amazing. The clam chowder tasted great. I was all good. And I know that's a silly illustration, but it took me stepping out of my comfort zone in a pretty uncomfortable way for me, pretty risky feeling to me. But when I stepped out of my comfort zone, there was reward. And I know this is way silly illustration, but when I was kind of thinking about this sermon and the text that I'm about to read, it made me think, like, why is it so hard for us to do in our spiritual lives? Like, why is it so hard for me to step out of my comfort zone in my real life? Like, why do I want to play it safe and I'm afraid to take risks, especially with Jesus, so often? Or like, why do I always cave to my comfort? Like, I'll always go with what's comfortable, even if I know that there's something better on the other side. And so as I was kind of researching this question, I realized this is a very, very old question. Like, before Jesus, but it's been researched through Christian circles, been asked through Christian circles since Jesus. Like, I mean, old people like Eusebius and Clement, people from like really like 100 years after Jesus. Like, that's how long people have been asking these type of questions. And I realized as I was looking through my text that this answer is right in the text. I believe that this is found in a passage in Matthew. I believe that Jesus answers this himself. So just to give a little background, Jesus has been preaching all around the Sea of Galilee, everywhere. And he ends up on the western side of of the Sea of Galilee, and he's preaching, and there's about 5,000 men. Now, some of your translations might say people, but it's really men. And most scholars think that there were 15 to even 20,000 people that he was actually preaching to. Not only was he preaching, but the people were getting hungry, and they needed food, and he turned 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish into food to feed 5,000 men, plus their women and children, and there were 12 baskets left over. This was a big deal. And the people got so excited that they all were like, we're going to make him king. Like, they were all like super pumped. Like, this is the Messiah, this everybody would be made for. They almost forced him to be king. So much so that the disciples were kind of in on it as well. But this is where the story begins to take an unexpected turn. The first thing Jesus does is he kind of slips out of this crowd. That wouldn't make normal sense in the day. You would have kind of built up your group, like your rallying cry, to kind of like come with you. That was a big deal. But not only that, he does something much more unexpected where he sends his disciples and he says, hey, you guys go cross the sea. You go across the sea. I'll catch up with you later. Now you might think about that and be like, okay, I don't really know why I do that. First thing is it's getting late, okay? Like, this is late at night. You wouldn't normally cross the Sea of Galilee at night. Second, usually these disciples, this would be your best time to kind of envision and impassion them after everybody's just seen a huge miracle and been excited. And thirdly, just 6 chapters and actually about 6 months before, in the fall, this is in the spring, about in the fall, they had just been in a boat with Jesus while he was sleeping, and they all thought they were going to die from the wind and the waves. They actually thought the boat was going to turn over and they were going to die. So this is like a big step. Jesus is saying, okay, yeah, I know last time you were scared and I was with you. This time, go without me. This is a big deal. And the disciples don't want to go. So it takes a little bit of arguing. You see that in the other gospel, in like John. You see that a lot. But then we kind of get to this passage, and Jesus goes up to pray. And this kind of brings us to our story. So if you would, you can flip with me. I'm in Matthew 14, and it's verse 23. You can follow along with me or in your own Bibles or however you want. Okay. So, it says, after he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone. People think this was about 3 or 4 a.m. in the morning. And the boat was already a considerable distance from land, about 3 to 4 miles from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. Come, he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. Now, there's about 400 sermons you could preach out of that passage, okay? But something that you want to understand is people say that, so the Sea of Galilee is surrounded by mountains, okay? It's like in a valley. And that means when there's winds in the valley, the heavier winds get pushed down, which means in a matter of minutes, like literally 5 minutes, it can go from being entirely still on the Sea of Galilee to waves. Some people claim over 20 feet. I think it was about 10. I think that sounds right. But that's still really big waves that happen in 5 minutes. And it can be really calm to life-threatening. And that's what people think this time was. In fact, there are times you can trace back storms, and there was a lot of storms around this time, about 81 through 80-40. There was a ton and ton of storms. And something else that really spoke to me in this passage is, so when Jesus in verse 27, he says, "Take courage, it is I." Now, other passages might say, "I am here," or "I am is here," or "it is I am." But what you got to understand is, first off, this would be like, there's not even a parallel illustration to how big this statement is in English. Like, for him to say, "It is I," he's saying to them, "I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Like, I am the God that you've been looking for. Like, you don't claim that you're God unless you're God. That's a very, very big deal. Like, let me show you real quick. In Exodus 3:13, you don't have to go there, I'll just read it. It says, "Moses said to God, 'Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them?' God said to Moses, 'I am who I am.' This is what you are to say to the Israelites. 'I am has sent me to you.'" Now this is what Jesus is saying, and that's a pretty big deal. All these disciples realize, I'm not just following a teacher anymore, I'm following God. This isn't just Jesus the man, this is Jesus who's God. And this leads us to verse 28, which I believe something immediately kind of like astounding happens. Somebody does something remarkable. And Peter in verse 28, he starts with, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." Peter, if you can see, immediately chooses to believe it. He doesn't have to. We don't know about the other disciples, but most likely people have been like, did he just say what I think he said? That's like me looking at everybody and saying, yeah, I'm the second coming of Christ. You'd be like, what did he just say? Like, that's like an insane claim. That is a huge claim. But then Peter does something even more remarkable. He asked God himself to speak to him. He says, not only do I choose to believe you, but I choose to make that a little bit of action. Call me. If it's you, tell me to come to you. And this is what I believe is the first step to being courageous, to stepping out of our comfort zone in our life, which is to invite God's voice into our life. Invite God's voice into our life. See, Peter asked this question completely out of faith. Peter probably couldn't swim very well. He probably couldn't see very well. Definitely in the storm, it would have been tough. It would also have been tough to hear. He would have had to really gone by faith. His senses weren't all the way there. You're in a storm, your adrenaline's going, it's hard to see well. He would have had to trust that it was Jesus. And the funny thing is, he's in a dangerous, a scary, a risky situation. But he asks Jesus to speak, even though God might give him a hard answer. Because, I mean, Peter's asking this knowing full well that he might say come, which means, like, I would have to actually get out of the boat. That's kind of scary. If I was Peter, I would have said something like, hey, are you sure? Like, where are you from? I would have asked him maybe a question like that, or I would have said, how did you first meet me? And then if Jesus was like, yeah, I put the coin in the fish's mouth and told you to find it, then I would have been like, okay, maybe it's Jesus. He doesn't even confirm Jesus' identity. He chooses to trust him. And it was making me think, how often do I purposely not ask God because I'm afraid he'll give a hard answer? Like, how often do maybe it's a homeless person that I'm walking by or I'm driving by, do I see and I purposely don't go, Jesus, what do you want me to do? Because I'm afraid that he might tell me to actually go evangelize to him or go give him something. That's tough. So I purposely might think another way. I might not say, God, I don't want you to speak to me, but I might purposely go, okay, let me think about, I got to make a turn, I got to go, what groceries do I have to get? I purposely think differently than what God might give me a hard answer for. Or maybe there's a waitress or waiter, going back to that, that's having a hard day, and I can tell that it's more than just bad service, but there's something going on. And I don't want to ask them a question because that's kind of awkward. Or that might be risky. Or it might be kind of weird. Or maybe somebody's asking for me to give something. Or heck, adopt. Or whatever. Something tough like that. That's big. And I go, I'd rather just not ask God. You know, if God's going to do it, he's going to make it really clear. I kind of make those situations in my mind. Because what Peter does here, when Peter asks God to speak, there's a willingness of him to trust Jesus. I think that's what we got to do. When we ask God to use his voice, we have to have a willingness to trust him. And so, for a minute, play with me. Let's say you're in this story, okay? Let's say you're in a boat. Like, kind of go back to the first century. You're sitting in this boat, and your friend Peter, kind of the loudmouth, talkative old guy, is in the boat, and you're kind of there with him. I'm just kind of imagining if I'm the disciple. So let's say you're in the boat, and this guy, Peter, goes, yeah, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you. Their first thought, they're probably like, what the heck is wrong with that guy? What is he doing? Why is he trying to get out of the boat? That's my first thought. And then when he starts getting out of the boat, I probably would have made a joke. Like, if I was like John or James or Philip, I would have been like, I call his tunic. Like, I call his fishing rod. I call his boat. You know what I'm saying? It would have been kind of like, people would have been joking, like, what is going on? Like, that's a pretty serious thing. They'd be like, well, he's dead. There's no way he's surviving this. He's getting out in the middle of a storm. But then I get to his brother Andrew. This is Peter's brother. He's also a disciple of Jesus. Andrew's sitting there. Now, I can imagine Andrew. They're all kind of making jokes. They're all making fun. But I can kind of imagine Andrew going like, Peter, what are you doing? Like, you have a wife. You have kids. What are you doing? Like, you could die out there. Like, you can't do that. And I can kind of imagine him maybe grabbing onto Peter like, Peter, what are you doing? Get back here. You're kind of crazy right now. And then I can imagine maybe Peter shoving him off saying, Andrew, I have to go. It's Jesus. Like, when will I ever get a chance like this? This is Jesus. I have to trust him. I have to follow him. And it made me think, how often in our lives, yeah, there's selfish, there's yes men, there's people that make jokes about our life, but what about well-meaning people in our lives? People that genuinely mean well in our lives, that tell us worldly wise counsel when God is ready to move. And sometimes God calls us to do things that don't quite make sense, but they're from God. And that's how we trust him. That's what faith looks like. I mean, how many soccer moms or relatives or our parents or financial advisors or people give us counsel that's well-meaning, that comes from the right heart, but it's not what God is telling us to do. Because sometimes we genuinely have to trust the quiet, unclear voice of God. Sometimes he doesn't speak in loud, auditory tones. He speaks quietly and meekly and kindly. You have to go, okay, I discern it in my heart, even though everyone else around me is telling me something different. Here's what God's telling me to do. And then I follow him. Maybe you're hearing this and you're going, okay, Corey, does that actually happen though? Like, it might happen today, but does that happen biblically? And I'm glad you asked. In Acts 21, there's a story like this. Paul's about to go to Jerusalem, okay? He is pretty much by this time the most influential Christian. He's the most influential Christian of all time we know now, other than Jesus, obviously. But about this time, he's kind of made his rounds. Like, people are like, oh, it's Paul. Like, he is the guy now. And Paul is about to go to Jerusalem, and it says that these people come up to him, prophets, Christian prophets, and it says they come to him in the Spirit, and they say, don't go. It's dangerous. It's risky. They say you will be arrested. You will be beaten. It is very dangerous for you to go. Don't go. And it says they do this in the Spirit. This isn't just like flesh. This is them speaking in the Spirit. And Paul looks at them. Paul goes, you might be right. In fact, I bet you're right. But God's called me to go. And I know I'm supposed to go. And what's crazy is he goes. He does get arrested. He does get beaten. But actually some of the most influential things that have happened in the history of Christianity happened there in Jerusalem. Like, that's kind of how the whole Roman world became to see who Jesus was. That's kind of how it happened. And Paul, as you see here, trusts God's voice over what people say, even good people, well-meaning Christians. But Paul doesn't just invite God's voice. He doesn't just follow God's voice. He does something that's the hardest step for us, which is he follows God's voice. And that's my third step. Not only do we have to invite God's voice, we have to trust his voice over all other voices, but we have to follow God's voice. I think this is hard for us. I mean, how many people say, oh yeah, I trust God. No, I'll leave it to God. I trust God's voice. But in reality, we kind of do our own thing. And then if we really feel like God's telling us something, we're like, yeah, I want to get confirmation from about 35 other people to make sure it's from God. You know what I'm saying? We kind of do that because then it's a little much. And if you look at verse 29, Jesus says something powerful to me. Peter says, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water. And Jesus simply says, come. He doesn't say, yes, Peter, it's Jesus of Nazareth, son of Mary and Joseph, brother to James. I remember when I called you out of the boat to be fishers of men. And I remember when I told you to go to the right and you'd find a fish with a coin in its mouth. Or when you would be overflowing with fish even when you'd already fished all day. He doesn't say those things. He simply says, come. Because what he does is he chooses to leave it in Peter's court. He leaves the ball in his court. He could have made it very clear that it was him. He could have, just like he had 6 months before, calmed the winds and the waves. And then said, now come. That would have been easier for Peter. He would have been like, okay, that's God. He calmed the actual storm. I'll walk. No. He leaves the wind. He leaves the storm. And I think sometimes God does that in our lives. He leaves the circumstances, the situations, the hard times in our life. And they're still raging when God calls us. Sometimes he doesn't calm it all before. It's sometimes not always the perfect circumstances or the perfect timing. But God still calls. Because Peter trusts Jesus here with his feet, not just his head. I think we do that a lot. We trust God with our head, not just our feet. You know, we say, oh yeah, I trust God, but we don't actually live it out. And I think this is what real faith is. Real faith leads to action. That's how we know Peter really believes it. He believes it's Jesus because he's not just willing to invite him. He's not just willing even to trust him over the others. He's willing to actually get out of the boat. And like, okay, how many of you guys have seen the movie Indiana Jones? Like, you like that movie, it's fun. Okay, cool. Does anybody else remember the scene where he's going through the temple, he's been there the whole time, he's kind of researched, he's going with all the people. Like, there's all these people behind him that he's kind of talked to, he's kind of researched what's supposed to be there, and he gets to this canyon. Now, at this canyon, there's supposed to be a bridge, okay? It's supposed to be like this bridge across, he walks across, and he figures out the whole thing. I don't remember the whole story, but I remember the scene, okay? And he gets there, but there's no bridge. And he's just looking down at a canyon, and he's like, geez, what am I supposed to do? But he knows that he's studied and researched this enough that there's supposed to be a bridge there. And Indiana Jones has to take an actual step of faith onto nothing. He's literally like, there's supposed to be a bridge there, I'm going to step. If there's not a bridge, he dies. But he steps, and he lands, and there's an invisible bridge. That's what it is. And then he throws it with rocks, and you can see that it's a bridge there. Cool. But that kind of made me think what it means with Jesus. Because it's so easy for us to be like, okay, well, as long as I see the pathway to get there. You know, okay, God called me. Okay, God, I'll walk on the water to you. Just you know, like, throw some logs right there or something so I can kind of see where to go. But no, Jesus leaves it to Peter, where Peter's going to walk on the water. He's going to have to trust Jesus the whole way. And if you kind of think about it, that's how God kind of does the most amazing things we know about him. Throughout the whole Bible. I mean, think about it. Like, even starting in the Old Testament. Okay, yeah, Noah, I know you're in the desert. Build an ark. Now, clearly, that doesn't make any sense. Noah was like, why am I building a boat in the middle of the desert? And that's how it shows only God knew. Or maybe, you know, somebody like Moses. Yeah, I know you stutter. I know you suck at public preaching. But yeah, why don't you go walk up to the most powerful person in the world and tell him to let everybody go? Yeah, you're a murderer and a fugitive of his people, but tell him to go. That doesn't make any worldly sense. Or maybe you're Gideon. You know, yeah, I know you only have 300 men, and I know none of them are good fighters. Go fight against 10,000 of the best fighters. Just go. Gideon's like, that makes no sense. That makes no worldly sense. But what faith is to trust God and then follow him with it. Or maybe Joshua, how about that? Joshua, yeah, I know you're a big conqueror, and I know you got an army. Why don't you just walk around the city for 7 days? And then blow your trumpets at it. He was like, what? Like, why don't we just fight them? We can probably, like, it would actually be a battle. Why would I walk around a fortress? But it proves that God is above our ways, you know. His ways are higher than our ways. His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. So it's not simply about what makes worldly sense, but what God has called us to, or even in the New Testament. Maybe you're John the Baptist, who's been preparing for the Messiah his whole life, and God goes, yeah, I know he's your cousin. I know you grew up with him playing games and stuff. Why don't you announce he's the Messiah? They were all like, you know, John was like, I helped change his diapers and stuff. Like, we grew up together. What? That doesn't make any sense. But he has to choose to follow God with his feet or with his mouth, not just with his head. And that's how God's power, that's how God's truth is showcased through our faith. It's not just by what we do, what we say, it's by doing stuff that doesn't make sense. And we go, okay, that must have been God. That doesn't make any sense. Now maybe you're here and you go, okay, Corey, I've heard all this before. I've heard this idea that I'm supposed to have faith and trust God. And you feel as if you maybe missed your chance. You go, I mean, I'm really past the days where I have to choose whether or not to follow God in hard ways. I'm kind of in the easy spot of life now. Or maybe I'm in a hard spot where I don't really have the choice to trust God. And I've got good news for you. I think the Bible makes it extremely clear. If you're not dead, God's not done with you. I think that's just a clear biblical truth. No matter how old you are, no matter how young you are, if you're not dead, God is not done with you. And I believe that there's always a step you can take. And I believe that it's clear, biblically, but also in this passage, that God is calling you to get out of the boat. Wherever you're at, get out of your boat. Maybe it's little, maybe it's big. Maybe it feels really big to you, or really little to you, and kind of awkward, but God is calling you to get out of your boat, wherever you're at. Maybe it's fear of failure, maybe it's insecurity, self-righteousness, pride. Maybe you need to get out of your boat. Maybe others around you will think that's not very big, but you know it's big to you, and that's what God's calling you to do. I think it's really, maybe it's addiction, maybe it's a certain sin, but you're stuck in it. Because a lot of times we get this idea that if I stay in the boat, I'll be safer. But Peter knew a fundamental truth, which is out on the water in the heat of hard circumstances and hard situations, it would be safer on the water with Jesus than in the boat without him. Even though it's unclear, it's risky, the winds would be howling, the waves would be crashing, it'd be the lightning, it'd be loud, it'd be scary, it'd be risky, it'd be dangerous, but it'd be safer with Jesus than in the boat without him. And that's what I call to you today. So I ask you, what's your boat? Maybe it's little. Maybe it's, I have trouble trusting God with my money. Or maybe I have trouble forgiving someone who hurt me. Or something big, like, man, it's hard for me to trust God with my kids. Or it's hard for me to let go of resentment. Or maybe, just maybe you're here today and you've been doing the religion game your whole life. You've been doing the whole, I'm going to do good things for God and he'll be happy with me. And maybe the boat you need to step out is unbelief. That maybe the whole New Testament's right, that it doesn't have to do with just me. That it has to do with who Jesus is. So, if that's you today, and you're stuck in this boat of religion, you're stuck in a boat of doing everything right for God, trying to prove that you're faithful, trying to prove that you're good enough for God, rather than trusting in Jesus and that he died for you and rose to give you new life, then maybe today you need to give your life to Jesus. You need to surrender your heart, your life, everything in your life to Jesus. And say, I can't do it anymore. You died because I couldn't. Because you were perfect and I'm not. If that's you today, I'm just going to say a little prayer. And this prayer isn't magic words. But the prayer represents something that's going on inside your heart. Something that you're doing where you're saying, God, I'm choosing to trust you. I'm choosing to believe you. I'm choosing to receive your grace and your forgiveness even when I might not see it or I don't feel worthy. But it's acknowledging that you're not worthy, but he is. And saying, okay, God, I'm not worthy, but I was worth it. You know, I wasn't worthy of your forgiveness, but I am worth it. That's why you died for me. So I'm just going to lead you in it. You can just close your eyes and say it with me. You can say it out loud or in your heart, whatever you want. But just know that you don't have to live trying to perform for God for the rest of your life. You don't have to be that way. Life doesn't have to go that way. That's not what God intended. God intended you to have life and life abundantly in him. All right, let's pray. Dear Jesus, thank you for dying on the cross for me. Thank you for rising again to give me eternal life. I admit that I'm a sinner. I admit that I need a Savior. Jesus, I receive your forgiveness. Jesus, I receive your grace. I invite you to come into my heart. I invite you to come into my life and make me new. Lead me. Holy Spirit, come in and never leave. I'll follow you for the rest of my days. In Jesus' name, amen. Now maybe that was you. And if it was, I'm so proud of you. That is the best decision you can make in your life. By far. But maybe you're here today and you go, I've done that before, Corey. I follow Jesus, but it's harder for me to live the daily walk after Jesus. And so, here's what I call you to. Invite God's voice in your life. Trust God's voice. Follow God's voice. But ultimately, you have to choose to get out of your boat. I think it's so easy today to be stuck in religion or in security. The world feeds it. That's what it does. But we have to choose, as Christians, as Christ followers, to say, I know that God has called me to be courageous. If you wonder why people around you, sometimes people don't know Christ, or if you wonder why your neighbor, or why your relatives, or your kids, or your relatives don't know Christ, aren't following Christ, it's because us Christians, me included, all of us, stay in our boat. God says, I'm calling you, go speak to that person. They need to know about Christ. And we sit and we're afraid. And what I'm telling you today is, I promise you, each and every one of your lives, God's calling you to take a step. This is how growth happens. It's just like a muscle. It has to become uncomfortable to get bigger. That's how it works. And that's how it works in our spiritual lives too. You want to develop faith, you have to take a step that's uncomfortable. That you go, okay, God, I have to trust you here. This has to be a step of faith for me to follow you. Not just me, not just my desires, but what you call me to. So just last thing as I close with one little thing. Imagine being those disciples, like we imagined earlier. They're all holding him back, they're all making fun of him. Then they see Peter get out of the boat and he's walking. And they're like, how in the world is that talkative guy who's kind of dumb and kind of just yells a bunch of stuff, why is he the one that's walking? But then I can imagine, maybe after a little bit, maybe they're on the edge of the boat, kind of like watching, and then they're kind of laxing up, and I can imagine them standing back a little bit and thinking, man, that could have been me. Like, I could have been the one that got out of the boat. I could have been the one that said, okay, Lord, if it's you, I'll come. I could have been the one that trusted it. But instead, I stayed in the boat, afraid. And the funny thing is, now Peter's more safe than I am. He's out on the water with God, the maker of the winds and the waves, the author, the master of the wind and the waves. That's way safer than me, right here on the boat. So, that's what I call you to. Don't regret it. Don't look back and say, I should have got out of the boat. I should have trusted Jesus. I should have taken the step. But instead I got afraid. Or instead I looked at worldly counsel. Or I made worldly sense of what God was saying. I encourage you today. God's calling you to take a step out of the boat. So do it. What are you waiting for? All right, let's pray. Jesus, Thank you for being willing to use us. Thank you for choosing to use us even when we don't deserve it, even when we don't make sense, even when you could just take us out of here and prove everyone that you're Jesus. Instead, you choose to use us. You choose to use the church. You choose to let us be your witnesses, your ambassadors for your gospel. Jesus, help us to get out of the boat in our lives. Help us when something's tough and we're making a hard decision to go, okay, I'm going to trust you, Jesus, over what I think, over what makes sense, over what my self-help book says. I'm going to trust what you say, what your word says. Help me to trust you even when the storms of my life are raging. Even when the wind's howling, the thunder's booming, help us to trust you. Help me not to play it safe, but to get on the water with you. Help us to trust you and to follow you. We want to be used by you and loved by you. We thank you.